This is Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families and your window into the world of special education. Special needs parenting can be challenging, and we want to make it easier by providing you with the resources you need to help your child. Let's delve deep into the world of learning differently with your host, special education attorney Adam Dayan.
I am so happy to present my next guest on this podcast, Gabriela Ponce. Gabriela Ponce was born and raised in Quito, Ecuador. In her late teens, she began to struggle with eating disorders and self-harm. In 1999, she moved to Baltimore to attend the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she graduated with a major in photography. Gabriela has spent most of her adult life focused on healing from trauma and finding wellness, peace, and stability through movement. In 2022, she became a certified life coach and has spoken extensively about her recovery and illness on various forums. Gabriela lives with her husband and daughter in Brooklyn, New York, is an athlete, and is writing a memoir about her journey. You can read more of her work at www.mybodymystories.com. Gaby, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Where and when does your story begin, Gaby?
My eating disorder developed when I was in my teens, but I think my struggle started far sooner. I struggled with emotional regulation as a child, and I think it just kind of like grew from there.
Do you want to define emotional regulation for our audience? I know that's something that we're going to be coming back to.
Yes, I experienced, like, if I was having like unpleasant experiences, they would escalate really, really quickly. So if I felt that I wasn't doing something right, it went from I'm not feeling like I'm doing this right now to I don't know how to do anything. I suck at everything. I'm never going to get it right. I'm never going to learn. Then it started, it would like just spiral into my sense of worth. I'm not worth anything. Nobody likes me. So it would really kind of just like spiral very quickly and just go out of control. And it was hard for me to stop it.
Sounds like a kind of catastrophizing or globalizing.
Yes.
So at what age were you diagnosed with an eating disorder, and when did you or your parents first become concerned that you might have a problem?
Well, I wasn't diagnosed with an eating disorder until I was a grown-up and living on my own, and I was actually married. I don't think my parents ever wanted to really face that I was struggling with something. There was definitely a sense of denial there. And, but my relationship with food and... Sorry.
Your parents' denial or your denial or both?
I think both. I think initially I was in denial of where I was headed. Then there was a moment of cognizance where I was absolutely aware of what was happening, but the eating disorder kind of became like my ground. And so, I would have never admitted to it, because admitting to it means that you have to acknowledge that there's something wrong. But in the meantime, my parents' denial was also there. Like, they didn't necessarily seek help from me. It wasn't really even talked about.
There are different types of eating disorders. There's anorexia, bulimia, binge eating, for example. Which have you battled?
I've touched on many of those. I started with I would say that my first experience into an eating disorder was a bout of restriction, which then led to a binge, which then led to a purge. So bulimia was sort of where it all started for me. And then that led into anorexia as I was able to more control the restriction.
And are you talking about your teenage years or a different time period?
Teenage years, I think the crux of it, I think I was 15 going on 16.
Was there any trauma or difficult circumstance you experienced that you think brought it on?
I think that I grew up in an environment that was certainly complex and complicated for a child. There was trauma there. I think there was also a neurological component that just kind of heightened my, what's the word I'm looking for? Just it made me more susceptible to an eating disorder. And then there was also a lot of cultural and behavioral components that I was growing up around that also kind of just made that an avenue that seemed like one worth taking.
Now, you don't have to answer this, but I'm wondering if you want to share more specifically about your trauma, what it was, to give listeners an idea of what you experienced.
Absolutely. I think there was, on one hand, my family was pretty dysfunctional. I'm a daughter of an alcoholic, and the codependence and the kind of like inner workings of alcoholic families were very present. I think also, which is typical with families of alcoholics, there's one person that kind of tends to be the peacekeeper, the pleaser, the one who takes on the role of minimizing the drama for everybody. And that became me as well. I experienced a lot of emotional abuse and bullying from my older brother. So that was another big part of it. And then I think there was also, my mother struggled with eating disorders. So there was also some modeling of behaviors that weren't necessarily healthy, but I saw how she coped with certain things through certain behaviors. And then I think that also modeled something for me as well.
Well, I want to just acknowledge that you've shared something deep and personal, and I think it's wonderful that you know that and are doing something with it. So, Gaby, in your experience, when does one's eating habit become an eating disorder?
So I think this is a really interesting question. It's a tough question. I think a lot of people struggle with disordered eating, and one does not equal the other. I think we live in a time of we live in this time of like diet culture. There's a lot of fad diets. There's always been this cultural component of kind of like manipulating our bodies and what health looks like, what beauty looks like. So I think a lot of people experience an eating that's not always balanced, or certain behaviors with food. However, I think the eating disorder differs in that, almost like with an alcoholic whose main goal becomes to escape the reality while focusing on something that can create a world in and of itself, and the control over that world is what helps them escape. I think that's kind of like where the eating disorder comes in. I often say that eating disorders are addictions. And I think when our food begins to take over our world, when we start placing our behaviors before experiences that might bring us anxiety, when that starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger, I think there's a real problem. And then there's like in the wellness and the health spectrum, there's also a moment where malnourishment is really, is also a sign. Like uncontrollable weight gain is also a sign. So there are these like physical signs of when the problem could be kind of red flagged, but I think it's so much more behavioral than it is physical. Mm-hmm. So I think there's many people that struggle with eating disorders that a doctor in a physical would never be alerted to unless they chose to confide their behaviors.
Yeah, and I think we're going to discuss a bunch of those points further in our conversation. I think some people listening may have a hard time imagining what it's like to battle an eating disorder. So can you talk more specifically about how the challenges you faced regarding your weight and body shape have affected your daily life?
Absolutely. So in retrospect, I can say that living with an eating disorder, with an active eating disorder, was exhausting. It really meant that I would say like 95% of my mental effort was placed in my relationship with food, the anticipation of how food would guide my day, how to avoid it in certain situations, how to navigate conversations around it. I mean, that was really, and again, like I equal this to like an alcoholic when their thought process throughout the day is just like, when is my next drink? I would say with someone with an eating disorder, it was sort of like, when is my next experience with food going to be, and how can I prepare for it, plan ahead of it, or just, and so that took up, and it takes up, I think, for people living with an active eating disorder, it takes up like their mental and emotional like day. So it leaves little room for other things, like personal experiences, work, like actual fulfilling moments in life. So that's, I think that's what's toughest about living with an eating disorder. And then there's also an enormous amount of time that is spent hiding it, obviously. And you have to be very, conniving, and that takes a lot of effort as well. So it's a really big project.
Yeah, I told you off the record, I've told you in previous conversations how so much of what you've experienced or shared with me has resonated in a deep way. And I've been open about having struggled with OCD myself. And so many of the things that you just mentioned, the fact that it's, and I'm not comparing my OCD to your eating disorder, they're different things, but there are similarities. And so what you said about it being exhausting, you talk about it in terms of food. For me, it was always about the eyes, having controls over my eyes and eyesight if I was feeling anxious or didn't know how to navigate a particular emotion or challenging experience, and avoiding those difficult feelings, navigating around your eating disorder or OCD, avoiding it in conversation. All of these things, as you said very articulately, take up a lot of mental and emotional bandwidth. And I think it's common for people with eating disorders and OCD not to talk so often or openly with people about their struggles. And that soaks up a lot of energy as well.
Absolutely. And to echo what you're saying, I mean, these are both big compulsions. OCD and eating disorders actually do have a lot in common. It's behaviors that you can rely on. It's behaviors that if you're experiencing some sort of discomfort, whether like it be, an anxiety over being in a situation that you don't necessarily know how you're going to navigate through, or just internal anxiety, the ability to almost like put that aside and focus on something that has been tried and true, that you're like, if I do A, then I get B. There's so much safety in that. And so we really start to rely on it. And then, it becomes the compulsion of like, I just need to make sure that nothing has changed, that everything is the same, that I can rely on something, because the idea of not being able to rely on anything does have us kind of spiral into this fear of chaos.
Chaos was the word I was thinking of. Chaos, unpredictability, overwhelm.
Yeah, I think they do have a lot in common.
So when you think of the absolute worst binge that you ever went on, or the most challenging moment you've had to deal with, what comes to mind for you?
I think that the worst binge that I've had, I mean, there's been so many, but they all have to do with this loss of control, this moment of either I've gone too far, there's no coming back from it, so why not just, completely go off the rails? I think I've had a lot of really intense moments in my eating disorder. Binges tend to come from an overwhelming sense of I've lost control. And I think it's a way of kind of like internalizing and making something, an emotional discomfort, making it physical. And it's both this sort of, I think it's an action that is sparked from not meeting an expectation. And then that's almost taken into this sort of loss of control. I didn't meet this expectation. Now what am I going to do? Now everything is wrong. And this sort of like this avalanche of feelings with binging becomes an avalanche of food.
And do you mean expectations that you've set for yourself, or expectations that you think other people have for you?
I think they go hand in hand. I think when you live with an eating disorder and other disorders, I feel that you set really, really, really high expectations for yourself. You strive for things to be, the bar is really, really high. Now, whether others perceive it that way or whether others hold you up to the same bar is tricky, because I would have people say, like, you don't have to do all this, or you're doing great. And I wouldn't buy it. I wouldn't believe it, right? So I feel like we're almost living in our own world. And so when my expectations weren't met, or when I assumed that somebody else's expectations weren't being met, even if they told me otherwise, it led me to this panic, and then it was, again, this kind of like this downward spiral of, I can't do it, I'm not good enough. And then that kind of like translated into the relationships with food. It was sort of like, well, if none of it is good, then why not just, throw it all away? Why not just, I'm having an overwhelming sense of emotion, why not consume an overwhelming amount of food? Why not just kind of like ignore the feeling and just replace it with a physical action that feels similar, but it's tangible.
And it sounds like some black or white thinking. Does that resonate with you?
Very, very. There's a lot of black and white thinking that goes into eating disorder behavior, compulsive behaviors as well, and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And you did ask me what the hardest moment was for me. And interestingly enough, the hardest moment for me wasn't during the eating disorder. It was during the recovery of the eating disorder. It was when I finally decided that I would feel my feelings and sit with emotions, and my coping mechanism had been set aside. So I think that was harder than anything else, because it really forced me to just be with discomfort. The relationship with food was a relationship of full control. So if I can kind of go through this a little bit, but if I felt discomfort and then replaced my discomfort with a food behavior, let's say a binge, and then I was in full control over how much of that discomfort I endured, and then I was in full control over what I did after that discomfort, which would usually be a big purge. And so the control element is huge. And I think when you don't know your feelings, when you are not in tune with your feelings, you feel such a loss of control that it's terrifying.
Yes, that's another thing that resonates strongly with me, and my eyes and eyesight compulsions were all about control in very similar moments as you're describing. And the part you say about feeling your feelings, I mean, I can't tell you how much that's come up on this podcast. Professionals talking about children who are avoiding feeling their feelings or thinking that because they're experiencing negative emotions, there's something wrong with them, especially post-pandemic, where these issues, especially in terms of anxiety and depression, have increased significantly. So I think it's true for everyone, especially now and especially for children, that we need to understand it's okay to feel your feelings, and some feelings feel terrible, but that's part of the human experience.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that feeling your feelings, it's such an interesting, it sounds very, it's simple, but it's not easy. I'll put it that way.
And if you don't have the tools,
yes,
or you feel you're lacking the tools to deal with those emotions, then it becomes infinitely harder.
Absolutely. And like I mentioned that there's a neurological component to all of these disorders, and I feel that this idea of feeling your feelings, if a child's feelings are really, really big, I feel that often, or my experience is often, and it was with me in my generation, parents didn't want children to have these huge feelings. It didn't make a lot of sense. Their life should be simple. It's sort of like, it's not a big deal. This isn't a big deal. There was a lot of, this isn't a big deal. Let's just get over it and move on. And so I never had space to feel my feelings, just because I lived in a time where children shouldn't have such big feelings. And so it was sort of like, we're going now, there wasn't that space. And I think a lot of people do have really big feelings, right? They have anxiety over something that might not make any sense to anybody else, but it's so real and true to them that sometimes you do need to like sit and feel that. And even if the entire group is already marching along and going forward, that time is necessary. So if we don't get that opportunity, which I don't feel I did, I had no idea how to feel my feelings.
And I feel like there's always this disconnect between children and their parents. And I have an example from the other day. My mind was all on work, and I'm thinking about all of the challenges that the workday is going to present. And my son, he's turning 5 years old, was singularly focused on his slippers that are coming in the mail. And I'm thinking about all these work challenges I'm going to have to deal with. And he is just so laser focused on those slippers. When do they arrive? And what color you think they're going to be? Daddy, can you guess what color they are? And do you think I got one, or do you think I got more than one? And for him, that's the most important thing in his world. Absolutely. At that moment. And absolutely. That's fine. In his world, that's the thing. And it makes our role as parents, and we're going to talk about your parenting experience later in the conversation, it makes our role as parents so important to validate whatever our kids are going through at that moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's times, same with my daughter, you forget that these small things to us are of such magnitude to children, right? So in the same way, like, oh, I broke my toy, it can be so devastating to a child. If it's your favorite toy, if you've lost something, if you've misplaced something, those are the early feelings of loss and that you need to learn to cope with. But if you don't have time because, well, hurry up, we're going to be late, then you don't get a chance to feel that feeling. And a lot of the feelings that we tend to not be in tune with are, feelings, the harder ones that you kind of need time to sit with.
Totally. So let's go through a short list of activities that people with eating disorders sometimes do to control their weight and shape, and tell me if these activities resonate with your experience.
Sure.
Make oneself throw up.
Yes.
Use diuretics or laxatives.
Yes.
Exercise excessively, and by that I mean pushing yourself very hard, or sticking to a specific exercise schedule no matter what, or feeling compelled to exercise.
Yes, this is a really tricky one, because I think there's an element of exercise that can be really empowering and I think that's where the line in the sand gets the hardest to read, with exercise, empowerment, movement, achievement, and eating disorders. It's really, really difficult, and that's one that is still very, it lives in this very, very delicate balance for me, and we can talk about that at length if you like. So all of these behaviors have been part of my illness at one point or another. They are all examples of looking for control. They're all behaviors that give us control over our actions, and they make us feel like we're in control. The irony is that as much as we feel that these keep us in control, we start to lose control over ourselves into the illness the more we rely on these.
Mm-hmm. And the exercise piece, which you said you're still managing, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So I've become an athlete since my journey into recovery, and I find that there's so much power in pushing a little bit harder, right? There's so much power in movement, and there's so much wellness in it. But I also have to be very cognizant of where that energy is coming from. So I often think about it in terms of, I don't want to give if I'm at a point of depletion. And I think that's where if I need to be honest with myself and I need to be true with myself. If I want to work a little bit harder because I know it's in me, that's a good thing. If I work a little bit harder because I'm trying to punish myself for not meeting an expectation or because I think I'm not good enough, then that's a very different. So it's the nature of where these come from. And I think, again, there's nothing wrong with striving and wanting to be more if it comes from a place of understanding of your self potential, of your, just of what you're capable of and what you can do if it comes from a place of goodness. But if it comes from a place of you not feeling like you're worthy and therefore you need to deplete to get there, I think that is a behavior that's not in tune with like this all-around wellness that we look for.
That makes a lot of sense, and it would seem that mindfulness would be very helpful in this sort of example. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Gaby, when was the last time you went on a diet, and what has been your experience with dieting?
Well, I do not diet. I started my recovery journey in 2006, so I can tell you that since then there's been no diet. I believe in balance. I believe in the ability to kind of adapt to different situations, and that requires flexibility. Diets are often not about flexibility. I think dieting is incredibly triggering for people that have this kind of like black and white thinking, that tend to deal with any sort of compulsion, because it's very easy to kind of start this expectation of something being so rigid, and then one misstep can really quickly lead you into this sort of like, well, now it's all ruined, and so I much more value the idea of a balance, of finding balance in everything.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I can't tell you that my experience with dieting started when I was in my early teens. My body was starting to change, and I was feeling some discomfort with it. And I started skipping meals. And like I mentioned previously, my mother struggled with eating disorders as well. And some of the behaviors that she modeled, I began to kind of take on. My mother wasn't she didn't eat consistently. She skipped meals, so I started doing the same thing. She went on diets. So I started to kind of do all that. And I also, we live in a world that kind of makes it so accessible. All these diets, do this, do that. It was just so prevalent that I just started to adopt these ways of disordered eating that ultimately just grew and grew to become something much bigger for me.
And I'm curious, you mentioned culture, and I'm wondering if you've noticed any differences in the culture of Ecuador as pertains to food, diet, and eating disorders versus U.S. culture.
Well, it's interesting because I think I can't tell you about numbers, I would have to do some research about the amount of eating disorders in one culture versus the other. But in the Latin culture, there was certainly, girls' value absolutely came from their physical appearance. And there was a standard, and it was very clear that if you looked a certain way, then you stood taller in society, and if you didn't, then you weren't taken as seriously, or there was all these consequences. So culturally, it was a really big deal to kind of head in one direction. And girls can be really, really mean and really intense, and so there was a lot of pressure in school as well about how your clothes fit, what you wear, all these how you look in a bathing suit. Like, these were such big things.
And in the U.S., in your experience?
I think the U.S. has more diversity. I think these pockets really, really do exist everywhere. This like intense social pressure to look a certain way, to be a certain way, it exists. But then I think the U.S. also has other pockets of, where there's more acceptance. I think the U.S. has been more of, I think there's public figures that have kind of come forward and challenged body image. And so there's a little bit more room, I feel, in the U.S., but that the pockets exist, they do. The U.S. is just such a bigger country, and, it's just vast.
Interesting. Talk about your childhood as you experienced it in the moment when you were a child versus your childhood as you perceive it now, looking back on it as an adult.
Sure. So, like I mentioned to you before, as a child, I had these really intense emotions, and I do have a tendency still to think very black and white. So things are either really good or they're really terrible. Expectations are either met or they're so far from what you imagine that it might as well be trash. And so I experienced life that way a lot, where a small disappointment became it became my world. And there was these just really big emotions that, like I said, I didn't really have the tools to handle. And then I also think that there was a lot of pain that I experienced as a child. And we almost touched on this a little bit too, that whether it's because it wasn't talked about, I didn't have a place to discuss it. And sometimes if I tried to discuss it with friends, my family, like I said, my family was dysfunctional and a little bit toxic. So some of my peers didn't have the same experiences. And so for a young girl, for like a 10-year-old to talk to another 10-year-old about a really big thing that's happening in their house, and the other 10-year-old has a much more structured, and they don't know how to even respond or react to that. And so what I was experiencing was that sort of, my peers were sort of like, whoa, I don't even know what to say to what you've just told me. And then that would kind of compound the sense of isolation and inadequacy, and make me feel a little bit more like, why is nobody why does nobody understand what I'm going through? So I think that was a really, really big challenge because I just didn't have the tools. My friends didn't have the tools because we were experiencing life through a very different lens. As a grown-up looking back on my childhood, I think that the biggest problem was my lack of understanding of what to do with these really big feelings and how to navigate them. I think the big feelings sometimes were totally warranted, and sometimes they might have not been as big as the situation at hand. But I had no idea how to handle a big feeling, and so that I think really affected my experience as a child. And now with retrospect, I can see that maybe some of the experiences were maybe not, they didn't have to be as bad. It was the fact that I didn't know how to navigate through them that was really the biggest problem. And so forgive me if I'm like, diving a little too deep into this, but I feel that it's sort of like I had a tough childhood. A lot of people have tough moments in their life. It's not something you can really guarantee is not going to happen, nor can you really avoid it. But if you can learn to navigate through those rough waters, then you make it out the other side unscathed, versus not knowing how to swim and then you make it out the other side like a total wreck. And so I think that's the biggest difference. As a child, maybe I thought that I was in these like crazy waters and that was the worst. And looking back, I think the waters were rough, but it was me not knowing how to swim that made the experience as bad as it was.
Sure. What role did self-harm play in your childhood and adulthood?
I think a really big one. The self-harm came after the eating disorder. And I'm going to call them both a form of self-harm. One is just a lot more immediate and visible than the other. I think, with eating disorders, we are destroying our bodies little by little. But it's just so subtle and not, it's something that not everybody will, it's not skin out in a way. I began self-harming in I was 16 or 17, and I think it was a combination of just anxiety and not knowing how to manage anxiety and frustration. And it was sort of like a peak of, again, like these really big emotions, but they just reached a new level where my coping had to be more immediate. Food is the relationship with food when you have an eating disorder. It's a long and steady one, and I was feeling something a lot more explosive at the time.
Do you want to share what you were doing?
Sure. I started initially with cutting, and I continued with cutting into my early 20s, actually into like my late 20s. And it was very similar to the eating disorder, a sense of loss of control, a sense of not having a space to feel my feelings, not knowing what to do with intense feelings, not having an outlet, an immediate outlet. That's, I think, the biggest difference between one and the other was the immediacy of the intensity of the feelings and not having that outlet.
And how would you describe the feeling after the cutting or self-harm? What did it do for you physiologically?
So I think there's like a couple of different things that happen. First of all, the act of self-harm, like we have all these feelings that are leading up like this crescendo, right? So it's like they're boiling and boiling and boiling, and they start feeling like we're going to explode, or I was going to explode. Then you get to this moment of like a complete explosion, and it's sort of like
release.
It's like the pressure pot, right? So you have this moment of release. I think the adrenaline that kicks in with self-harm gives you this kind of experience. It's interesting. It's like the release is one aspect of it. I think there's an emotional release that you can but it usually leads to tears and leads to crying, which is so cathartic if you can get there on your own. I don't think I used to know how to get there on my own. So any kind of like physical, doing anything physical to my body would promote the tears, which was really cathartic, and it would kind of like allow me that emotional release. Then there's the adrenaline that comes with, when you hurt yourself, your body just kind of disconnects for a second because your nervous system is preventing, it kind of rushes to heal, and it's preventing the pain. So you're in this state of being very removed. And it's something that to me used to be really, really helpful because I could see my actions, but I couldn't quite feel them in my body just yet. But then there was also like an emotional component of I would completely just unravel and finally cry. And so these things were all happening kind of simultaneously. And it was just like this big, just the spillage of everything. And then the aftermath of that, though, was the hardest because it is, I call it the emotional hangover. It is coming back to realize that you've caused damage that is now very visible and needs to be addressed. There is then this exhaustion that comes with it. So you're so depleted that you're just tired. And then if this happens in a way that it's affected anyone around you, like if you have not been able to keep this to yourself, then you have to deal with everybody else's emotions around what you've just experienced. And that is also, there's so much shame in that and so much exhaustion and kind of, it's after a hurricane, you've got to do all this damage control.
It sounds exhausting. And thank you for sharing that deeply personal information. And I know there are young people out there going through something similar. And I know that your words are really going to resonate and connect with them. So thank you for sharing that.
No, thank you.
Gaby, describe yourself physically. How tall are you? What is your current weight? What do you consider to be a healthy weight for someone with your physical characteristics?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, this is a tough question. I can describe myself physically. I'm 5'3". I have not weighed myself in almost 5 years now. I don't weigh myself. It's a huge trigger for me. And I think my wellness comes from a different place. I'm sorry. I also don't believe that the number on the scale is the best metric for health. I have there's what the medical community considers overweight, underweight. I really struggle with those points of measurement because I think that bodies are so unique in how they present themselves and their abilities. I think that you can have athletes that are incredibly strong and the numbers on the scale mean nothing compared to their physical ability and their stamina. Or, I also know people that are just of a much their frames are just small, and it doesn't matter how much they eat. They will be that way, and that also doesn't determine their health. So I think it's a very difficult measure, even though it's a number, but there's so much that goes into it. So that, I think that's not a way that where I measure my health or my stability. And it's, I think I measure my wellness in various ways.
Give us a sense of the physical toll your eating disorder has had on you.
Well, I can tell you that living with an eating disorder puts your body through what I call a war. In my life, my eating disorder robbed me of daily energy. It robbed me of sleep. I was sleep deprived. I wasn't sleeping well. I became calcium deficient. My nails, my bones, they weren't strong. My hair, I was losing hair. The bulimia took a toll on my teeth, because when you throw up, there's all this, acidity, and that's coming back into your teeth aren't meant to handle that on a constant basis. So the toll that it took on my body, and just, I also was on this I was a big yo-yo. My weight fluctuated so much from one extreme to the other, that, that affected things as well. I even think that it affected the way my taste buds worked at one point or another. And so I think it did. I think I put my body through a lot. As a woman, I stopped getting my periods. So I think I regressed a lot in terms of, my body's functions. And then I do have to say that I'm really blessed and lucky that my body has been as resilient as it has, and that despite everything that I've put it through, I have been able to kind of get to where I am now. And just I was able to kind of catch up to where I should have been. And then I've been able to go so much further.
Thank goodness for that.
Yes.
Gaby, what does looking in the mirror mean to you then as a child in the throes of your disorder versus now as an adult, having made great strides in managing your challenges?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because looking in the mirror for me has been a very interesting, it's an interesting exercise. When I was younger and I looked in the mirror, and again, this came from modeled behavior, I saw how a lot of women looked in the mirror, and it was usually with a really, really critical eye. You don't stand there to say, I look absolutely beautiful. They stand there and say, well, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that. They start nitpicking different aspects of their body. So when I began to look in the mirror, my experience of looking in the mirror was always with this very critical eye. When I was in the deep struggle with my anorexia, looking in the mirror was it was a compulsion. I did it at the same time daily to make sure that I could spot the same things, that I was looking the same way. It was this idea of measurement. And so it was just a ritual. It was a ritual.
Everything needs to be just so.
Everything needs to be just so. And we talk about OCD, I would look at myself in the mirror under the same light, standing in the same spot, everything had to be just so. There was just, if the shadows were important, all these, it just had to be just so. So it would give me a constant that I could feel safe with.
You beat me to the punch. That's exactly where I was thinking. And if anything is not just right, you got to repeat that routine to get it right.
Yes. I mean, and that becomes your ground. If that's not there, then you just start falling into this abyss of unknown. Completely. And one of the really interesting things with looking at myself in the mirror was that I would do it when everything was just so, right, in the morning, like these rituals, these compulsive rituals. And then I would avoid it everywhere else because I remember I took a dance class, and dancers, for a lot of different things, it's important to look at your body in the mirror. It's important to see form, shape, how you're doing. It's a really good check if you're trying to achieve something. But for me, it was just the scariest thing in the world. So
it was a trigger. And the nature of triggers is that if you succumb to it, you're going to end up in this loop.
Yes. And so I could not look at my body in movement. And when I look in the mirror now, I think there is still an element of a daily sort of reinforcement of I'm here and my body tells my stories. I am a mother. I am an athlete. There's so much that's gone into my body now that when I do look at myself in the mirror, I have to constantly allow myself to accept rather than compare or judge. And I have learned to look at myself in the mirror now. I'm a boxer and I do exercise. Sometimes I'll jump rope in front of a mirror. I'll shadow box in front of a mirror. And it's really hard because now I'm looking for, remember when I was talking about the difference in sports, if you're aiming to achieve because you know you can do better and it's coming from a place of self-confidence and belief, it's one thing. But if you're coming at it from a place of I need to punish myself, it's another. I think it's really similar with the mirror. If I can look at myself in the mirror and say, what am I doing and what should it look like in these activities? It's a great way for me to connect and correct and see. If I'm looking for perfection and I see that I don't look the way I wanted to look in my mind, then it's a recipe for disaster and I need to just walk away.
That's really powerful. How important is your weight to you now?
I would love to say that my weight is not a factor in my stabilityness and my happiness or in my sense of calm, but that wouldn't be realistic. I definitely have a comfort zone when it comes to my body. It's a zone that I continuously need to kind of. It's got to pivot. It's got to be a flexible zone because there's times when my body is going to enter a stage or a phase where I need to allow for something different. And so it is a zone that has to be on the sliding scale. But within that, I do have a zone of comfort and I have a zone of discomfort. And if I ever enter a zone of discomfort, I look at it as a good sign to just kind of like come back to the wellness that I have achieved through the recovery with working with nutritionists. So I do have like a base that is kind of gives me the nutrition I need, the energy I need, and the wellness I need. And so if I can, that's like my center, that's my map. So if I'm ever feeling a little off, I come back to my map and make sure that my bases are all covered.
Mm-hmm. We've talked a bit about anxiety. How would you describe the role that anxiety has played in your life?
I think anxiety has played a huge role in my life and my development and how I've just experienced every situation that I've been through. I have high anxiety, and I think that
we could start a group.
Yes, we can. There's many people can join us. A whole movement. Anxiety is, something that it kind of just takes over my body. It's a fight or flight reaction. It's sort of like sometimes I say it's like the porcupine. when we live with anxiety, something little will just cause all our needles to just like boop, and it can be really destructive, right? We can hurt others. We can pop the balloons that are not. So we just need to learn to keep it at bay, and a lot of that is just presence of mind.
I can't help but picture a porcupine. Are you picturing a porcupine?
I absolutely am. In a room full of balloons, and you're like, no. But I know that, I mean, anxiety with the eating disorder, with a sense of loss of control, and with a history of just instability, anxiety is the first thing that's always kind of lurking.
So I've had my own struggles with OCD, as you know, as we've discussed, which is also anxiety-based. I know I've learned tricks over the years for managing my own anxiety. I'll also mention I don't think I would be the lawyer I am, or I might not be a lawyer at all if not for that anxiety and OCD. We've talked on previous episodes about some of the benefits of these kinds of issues or disorders. Talk about some of the tricks, Gaby, that you've learned to manage your anxiety.
Well, first of all, I should mention I do take anti-anxiety medication, and that's a big component of it. I do believe that for a lot of these disorders, the neurological component in the brain chemistry is real, and there's an element that if we can kind of manage that in some way, it gets us to a place that then everything else becomes a lot more manageable. With managing my anxiety, there's a lot of different things that I do, and it depends on the situation and the ability. I sometimes manage my anxiety with movement and exercise. I will do it with like meditation and breathing. I can manage my anxiety with sort of like writing. This is hard because it's never the first thing that comes to mind, but taking a pause and sitting with a discomfort, the discomfort that is anxiety, can be very uncomfortable for, let's say, like 3 or 5 minutes, versus acting on it immediately, which might then start a behavior that will cause discomfort in some other area of your life for a much longer time. So sometimes it's a moment of pause, of reminding myself, you can feel your feelings. Not every feeling lasts. There's no feeling that lasts forever. And also just sometimes reminding myself that I see things and experience things very differently than others. And that kind of puts me in check, because if I'm anxious that I've said the wrong thing or done the wrong thing, I'll remind myself that I might think that, but the chances that the people around me are as sensitive to my actions as I am is unlikely. And so again, it's like sit with this discomfort for 5 minutes. If life keeps going, then it's been 5 minutes of discomfort and nothing's happened. And so it's, I think a lot of those are my tips and my tricks.
That's very reassuring, certainly. And I'll say I'm a big meditation and mindfulness person. Say a few words about what meditation and mindfulness has done for you.
I think, so first of all, meditation and mindfulness is a really great way to bring me back to the now. I think that a lot of people who live with anxiety, we're focused on the what ifs, on what's going to happen later, and none of these thoughts are in a world that we are living in at this very moment. So it's really important to kind of just bring yourself back to like at this time. And meditation for me sometimes is as simple as like fact checking. I didn't bring an umbrella. Well, is it raining right now? It's not. So that's just a fact. And I'm going to sit, just breathe into that fact. And And meditation takes on so many different forms, but it's the grounding. It's the grounding and just coming back to the here and the now that I think is so key.
On the subject of your anxiety, what was or what has been the associated fear for you? Does it have to do with a sense of loss of control? I know we've spoken a bit about that. If you gain another pound, then what?
Well, I think the anxiety is definitely a loss of control. I think when we dig deep down, there's a different feeling that will arise, which is, I think, the feeling that we try to avoid, which is my worth, right? I think we hold ourselves to these expectations, a high bar, because whether it's been the case in our own personal experience or whether it was actually the case in our surroundings, that we don't feel a sense of unconditional love. Like we seem to feel that things are conditional. So if I meet A, then things will be okay. If I B, then things are fine. It's like if one, then another. And I think that's really difficult because it really all boils down to, what if I don't meet any of these prerequisites? Am I okay? Am I loved? Will I be safe? Will I be happy? I think that's the bottom of it all comes from that. So it's sort of this anxiety comes from a place of like, will I be okay if all of these measurements that are in place, measurements of stability, of success, of happiness, or whatever, if I don't meet any of those prerequisites, will I be okay? And I feel that I specifically and very personally struggled with that because of how I experienced relationships while I was growing up. They felt conditional to me. And so there was always something that I wanted to meet, an expectation I wanted to meet, because I felt that if I didn't, then something, I'd be at a loss. And I spent a lot of time just feeling like, coming back to myself and being like, it's okay. It's just, if you don't get there today, you don't get there today. Again, the mindfulness doesn't mean you won't get there tomorrow. It's just today, and that's okay. Just that self-acceptance, I think, is huge.
Yeah. Safety, love, stability, things that every child and every person wants to know will be there regardless of how they show up or achieve or look.
Absolutely. And actually, this is something really interesting that I'm just kind of like tying it together. We talked about being a little child with big, big emotions. And, this idea that parents are sort of like, we don't have time for this. I think kids learn then that like this part of them, this very intense part of them, isn't too accepted. And then if they learn that that's not too accepted, then we learn that like that's a bad part, or and then it's sort of like, well, if I act that way, then there won't be time for me, there won't be space for me. And so we start to kind of reject and renounce an integral part of just who we are based on our what makes us. And then that's the fear, right? If we are ourselves, if we do act from a place of just complete just inhibition and feelings, whether it be good feelings or bad feelings, will there be room for it? So yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Lack of inhibition, right?
Lack of inhibition, yes.
Well, yeah, that's deep. And how did your eating disorder affect your academics in school when you were a child?
I was always an overachiever, right? I think people with anxiety and compulsions tend to be. my academics in school weren't really, I don't think you could see they weren't like directly affected. I think my social interactions at school certainly were. My relationships were. And then in college, I went to a fine arts school. And I would say that my eating disorder and my education did kind of actually meet a little bit more because being an artist and being encouraged to explore feelings, things that nobody talks about. Artists are meant to explore these like deep, dark places of ourselves. I did try exploring a little bit of my eating disorder with my art. I don't think I was quite there in my understanding of what I was going through to have it be successful, but there was a little bit of a curiosity that I think was helpful, in that opportunity, this sort of room to self explore.
I just want to share, I had a vision just now as you were speaking that you and I are going to write a book together one day. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I see it.
I love it.
So Gaby, talk a little bit more. You said it affected your social and emotional development. Say a few more words about how.
Well, when I was a child, and I mentioned having these really big feelings, big emotions. I think some of my peers struggled with seeing that. I could have had a big emotion to like losing a soccer game, and my big emotion was very, very, very just catastrophic compared to them. And I think that affects how other children, they're like, wow, I get it that we lost, but that's really, and children without tools to kind of help their peers in this situation tend to then, maybe shy away, maybe they have the best intentions, but they don't help in the right ways. And so I think that that influenced a lot of my friendships. At a young age, I had friends that were a lot more open to listening to what I was going through, and others that were just like, that is, that they're like, that's way too much, can't handle this. And then the eating disorder, as it started to take over my life, it affected friendships because I would seek distance from people that were maybe concerned, and rightfully so, and wanted to help. And maybe I started just kind of like creating more distance in those relationships. I maybe started forming relationships that might have been a little more enabling, and that would have allowed me to like foster this eating disorder that I was kind of, feeling was my lifeline. And then into adulthood, the biggest relationship that my eating disorder absolutely affected, I got married when I was in the midst of my eating disorder. And when I began recovery, my marriage didn't hold up. And I think a lot of that was because I was a different person before recovery. And when you are true to yourself and you can live fully in all of yourself, the people that are around you are they become very different. And the compatibility with my husband wasn't there when I was well, compared to the compatibility that we had found and created when I was ill.
Yeah, that makes sense. What role have shame and guilt played in this experience for you?
I think that shame and guilt have a really big role at various different times.
And can we just define those words real quick? Tell me if you're in agreement with this definition. Shame meaning I'm a bad person, guilt meaning I did something bad.
Yeah, I think I would also say that guilt is sort of like, I wish I hadn't, and this is going to, I think that's a really interesting. So shame is I'm a bad person, and guilt is I I shouldn't have done that.
Right. So shame is putting the emphasis on the person and interpreting that because you did something bad, you are a bad person, versus guilt is focusing on the behavior. That thing I did was a mistake. That thing I did, I wish I hadn't done. That thing I did was bad in that moment.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good, like, definition of both and allows for the separation.
Okay, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, what role have they played in your life?
Well, I think that despite them being very different, they do tend to go hand in hand. I think that shame followed me for a lot of my upbringing, just because I felt that I wasn't enough. I felt that I wasn't good enough. And so I had this constant kind of weight on my shoulders that I'm not worthy, and that was shameful.
And by the way, it goes back to the black or white thinking, which I've told you resonates with me. And it's that interpretation when you're a kid, that because you did something that was a mistake or not ideal in a particular moment, when you're interpreting that as I'm a bad person because of that mistake I made, I mean, the burden that places on you as a child.
Yes, I think it's the black and white thinking, and then the association, right? I did a bad thing, therefore I'm a bad person. Those are not one and the same. You know, you can do a bad thing, it's a mistake, you have to move on. It does not make you a bad person.
Exactly.
And I think that differentiating that is really key to being able to kind of like free yourself from these really intense feelings. And as children, you know, they're so heavy. So like I said, I did have a lot of shame growing up. And then I think my sense of guilt was when it would be brought on and compounded when I began to see certain behaviors I would see the reactions to certain behaviors, and then I'd feel really guilty. You know, I've done this, you've hurt my feelings, and I feel really guilty that I've done this to you. So now it's the shame that I was feeling because of how I feel about myself, and then add the guilt that you're responsible for something else. And it happened a lot, you know, with like people would try to make you feel better and say, well, you know, look at that person, you have so much compared to them. And then you'd feel guilty because you have this sense of shame. And on top of that, now it's kind of like compounded. Hurting people's feelings with the eating disorder, I think is also, you know, it's an illness, like and an addiction. So you put it before you do your relationships. So people get very hurt in the way, and then there's that, you know, that guilt that arrives.
What should parents listening to this episode be on the lookout for when considering if their children might have eating disorders?
Well, I think eating disorders are about so much more than just the eating behavior. And so I think, you know, I think that if you're noticing that your child is, you know, that their weight is kind of very erratically changing due to eating behaviors, I think that's a red flag for sure. But I think you can kind of take it back and maybe notice it sooner if you notice that your child has struggle with coping, and then that anxiety is kind of like directed over to the food. If you notice that food is becoming their safe place, if food is becoming a topic of huge importance, if food is the top of their priority in a way that is limiting them from going places, doing things, whatever, then I think that's a bigger concern. And it's something that, you can kind of like start to see these behaviors present earlier. Then, like I mentioned, I was not diagnosed with an eating disorder until well into my adulthood. And because my weight didn't become an issue until later on, and people weren't really maybe noticing the behaviors. So as much as food is obviously a huge part of the eating disorder, I think there's other behaviors that come sooner, and depression and anxiety, I think are definitely things that we can keep our eyes out.
And self-worth plays into this as well,
100%.
Sometimes these kinds of disorders or issues are signs of someone feeling poorly about themselves.
Absolutely. And, that's especially when regards to eating disorders, I found it really fascinating recently. I read somewhere, and I don't remember who wrote it, but self-esteem and self-worth doesn't come from your parents, and this is for girls or boys, it doesn't come from people telling you that you are good looking, that you are strong, that you are beautiful, that you, it doesn't come from compliments. Self-worth comes from validation. So if you say, I feel this way, I believe you. Tell me more. I'm going through this. Okay, tell me more. So when you give a child space to be what they are, go through what they're going through, and you allow for that, that builds a much, much stronger sense of self-confidence than telling someone, but you're so pretty. It's sort of, and I think we're really I don't think a lot of us know that. If a little girl is crying over something, well, don't cry because you did this good thing. And it's sort of like, well, no, you're crying. Tell me why. How do you feel? And that builds a very different sense of self.
Totally. Are you currently in treatment, or have you received treatment in the past?
I've received treatment in the past, and I'm currently I'm in therapy, but I have not, like, the treatment for my eating disorder and the recovery. It began in 2006 and it ended in 2010, I would say.
Can you give our listeners an idea of what happens in a typical therapy session in your experience?
Absolutely. So I've had I've had a lot of different types of therapy. And every kind of therapy teaches me something new. I think the overarching umbrella of therapy is that it is a safe place to go and feel your feelings, express yourself. There's no judgment. It is a place to really just be who you are. And then it's with someone who can guide you through it and give you the tools to navigate some of these tough feelings. I've had therapy that was a lot about connecting with my past. I feel there was a lot of repressed feelings and a lot of, for lack of a better word, misunderstood dynamics and experiences. And so there's been therapy where I've been able to go back and dive into an experience and then feel my feelings about it and kind of heal in that way. And then there's been therapies that I've had where they help me more connect to my body, because I feel that sometimes we separate our logic and our emotions, and then our emotions, we feel our emotions in our body. We feel sadness, we feel pain, we feel happiness, we feel them in our body no matter what our logic wants to say about them. And I feel that sometimes when we've experienced trauma, we tend to kind of like disconnect, and we can live in our head a lot and be like, well, I experienced this, but it's for A, B, and C reason and everything. So I've had some therapy, which has just been kind of almost meditative, to try to bring my feelings back into my body and allow me to connect that way. And then I've had therapy that is more behavioral, and that kind of gives me the tools to kind of like go now further. And I think I have this weird analogy that I sometimes use, because I say that part of my therapy was to recognize the ingredients that I have on my table, right? And these are the experiences that we've had, where we've come from. Not all of them are pleasant. Some of them might be a little bruised, rotten, definitely not good for like a fresh salad. And you need time to kind of acknowledge all of that and let that sit with you and accept that. And then there's a therapy that sort of tells you can't change any of the past. You can't change any of these ingredients that are on your table. So how are we going to do what we can with it and move forward, right? Are we going to, if we can't make a fresh salad, then do we make a soup? Do we, can we like switch things around so that you can take everything that you've had and use it to enforce and drive who you are going forward? And it's building the sense of empowerment and acceptance.
Yeah, I've heard you say that analogy before, and if I'm being honest, the first time I heard it, it didn't sink in fully. My mind keeps going back to it, and every time I think about it, it sinks in deeper and deeper. And I relate it to my own experience. And for me, growing up, perfectionism was a big thing. And so if I wasn't living up to being perfect, then the ingredients were rotten. And I've come to realize that I can take those ingredients, that experience of struggling with OCD, and talk about it in a way that builds connection. For example, connecting with you here, we have a lot in common, and connecting with other people for whom this story could be helpful. And so I want you to know that analogy has really been giving me all sorts of clarity. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think it's really wonderful if we can learn to change our perspective, because I think that we all have, there's always many sides to a story. And if we have a relationship that didn't work, or we have an experience that was unpleasant, there's certainly that reality to it. And then there's also, once you want to move on from that, it's sort of like you just have to switch your perspective a little bit and say, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with this relationship that didn't work? So the relationship wasn't good, but I learned all these things from it. So going into my next relationship, I have all this knowledge. This experience was really unpleasant. How can I create pleasant experiences because of it or despite it? And they just become pieces to our puzzle.
Love that. What has been the single most effective aspect of treatment in your experience?
I think the most effective aspect of treatment has been the ability to get to know myself, get to accept myself, and get to feel my feelings in a way that that is not judgmental, that's not, I shouldn't have done that, or I think the ability to say, I did that because it felt like the right thing to do at the time. Like, I really like that phrase because it's very forgiving. It allows me not to dwell on things from the past. Oh, why'd I do that? At the time, that felt like the right thing to do. And it also allows me to not be beholden to something in a future that might change. At the time, that felt like the right decision, or right now, this feels like the right decision. if you ask me tomorrow, I might have a different opinion on it, but we act on what feels good right now, right? It's that mindfulness and knowing that it might not, in the long run, we might look back and see that it wasn't the best thing, but at the time, if it feels right, we can accept that. That's, it's okay.
And you can always change course later. If you get
Absolutely.
new information and you feel you should be doing something differently, you can change course.
Absolutely. I think that is a wonderful, it's a freedom to say, this feels right now. I'm going to do it this way. Tomorrow, that seemed silly. I'm going to do something different. And you have the freedom to do that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What do you want our listeners to take away from your story?
I think all in all, it's so important to understand that everybody lives an experience that is unique to them. And, from our parents to our children to our peers, we are all living a life that is unique to us, how we feel things, how we experience this, how we see our experiences is so personal. So it's hard to expect from others what you would do with something, and it's hard for others to expect from you. Like, we just need to allow to be individuals. And I think we allow room to grow. We allow room for mistakes. We allow room for relationships to be successful, and we allow room for relationships to not. Like, there's a place for all of this in everybody's life, and if we just kind of open ourselves to it.
Mm-hmm. How has your experience affected your parenting?
This experience has affected my parenting in very, very deep ways. For one, well, I'm a mother to a girl who is going to be 10 this summer. So
Can't believe she's turning 10.
I know, can you believe that? It's insane. With my daughter, first of all, I am very cognizant of the example that I set as a woman, because I know she's watching, I know she's listening, I know she's learning from me. So I'm, I keep myself in check for her benefit. I also, knowing my struggles with emotion regulation, I absolutely make sure that I give her space to be herself. And it's something that her and I learn it together, because I need her to be herself while I have room to be myself, and herself and myself sometimes are at odds with each other. So it's a dance. And but I want to make sure that she has the tools that she needs, and that I'm teaching her what I can. At the same time, I realize that I don't have all the tools. So sometimes it's about letting her find her own tools. It is. It's this delicate, delicate balance. But I think acceptance of the fact that I cannot control who my daughter is, I think that is coming from my experience, allowing her that freedom and that movement to be whoever she needs to be. And like we were saying, if it feels right now, who she is today is not who she's going to be a month from now. And, allowing myself that space is great. Allowing her that space is also great. It's great for her. So I think that's the biggest effect that it's had, is to kind of give me this space and this openness.
How do you talk to your daughter about food, and what professionals do you rely upon to guide you?
Well, when I talk to my daughter, and I should say my daughter was just recently diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and her relationship to food is very interesting. She likes consistency. She likes regularity. And so she's not very experimental with the foods that she hasn't tried, doesn't like. I read somewhere recently that children with autism tend to shy away from fruits and vegetables because they're inconsistent in their flavor and their texture, and it's unreliable, and that can trip them up. And so with my daughter, but I don't want to hyper focus with her on food. So we talk about balance, and we talk about wellness, and we talk about making sure that, I say our body is like a car and it needs fuel. The better fuel we give it, the further it will go. But then I still find room to kind of make space for her preferences and her feelings and her experiences when it comes to how she experiences food. I want her to be balanced, but I also can't force her out of her comfort zone. If she doesn't like something, we will find another way to find that balance in our wellness, and we'll just modify.
And what professionals have been helpful?
I've resorted to therapists and psychiatrists when it comes to both me and my daughter in this area. Pediatricians have been a little tricky for me with my daughter because I think they are a little more they're a little more structured and rigid on their understanding of children's physical health, and sometimes there's less room for their mental and emotional health in that. So I've struggled with pediatricians a little bit when they're like, well, just do this for your daughter, just have her do this, or just tell her to eat that, or she doesn't get anything else. And it's more complicated than that. So I kind of rely more on mental health professionals.
Okay. And how has your experience affected your marriage?
Like I said earlier, my first marriage was definitely affected from my eating disorder. My current marriage, I was always very transparent with my husband about who I am, what I struggle with, my emotional dysregulation, and my coping mechanisms. So luckily it's not something I've ever had to keep from him. As a matter of fact, it's become something that I can let him know, and I'm saying, I'm struggling now, so you'll see, if you see this behavior, please come help. And so he's on my team. He'll be like, what do you need? How can we help? And it's brought us closer, really, and it makes for a wonderful partnership, just knowing that I can be open and completely honest and transparent, and that he makes room for me without false expectations, and also has my best interest and will kind of guide me.
Nice. Do you think of yourself as cured, or is this something you're always going to have to manage?
I think this is something that I will always live with. I always say that I'm in recovery of an eating disorder. It's always just lurking. I've learned to manage it, and I've kept it at bay through really big life changes, marriage, divorce, pregnancy, child, like all of it. But it's still it's like an alcoholic. It's just one day at a time.
A little monster that's always lurking in the background.
Yes.
I hear you there. What resources do you want people to be aware of? Where can our listeners who might know someone suffering from an eating disorder be able to get professional help?
I think that I've worked with a center called the Renfrew Center, which is one of the largest eating disorder centers around the country, and they are really wonderful, and their approach to healing is great. So I'm an advocate for that. I also I'm a huge advocate for therapy, and I think some people. It used to be so taboo. It's less so now, but I think it's a wonderful lifeline. And I also think that psychiatric help can play a really huge role too. I know that some people really struggle with the idea of being on a certain medication, and I think all of these things kind of combined can make a really, really big difference.
Are there any lifestyle changes that you found to be helpful in managing your eating disorder and anxiety outside of any professional help you received?
Yes, I wholeheartedly believe in a holistic wellness, that everything in us is connected, from our activity to our sleep level to our nutrition. Like, we're just one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. So in my wellness journey, I mentioned that I've come to rely on movement a lot, and I find that for me, movement is key, right? I need energy to move, and so that's going to come from my nutrition. And I need to be, I need to be hydrated. I need to be strong. I need to be powerful in order to move. Once I move a certain amount, I will be tired. If I'm tired, I will sleep really well. If you sleep really well, you dream. And I'm a big believer in the power of dreams and how they can affect our psyche. And I think there's so much freedom in us resolving issues that might cause us anxiety in the safety of our dreams. It's a great place. And I don't know about you. My dreams are usually they're not terribly bizarre, but they are more about life interactions. And I find that it's a safe place for me to, have these huge arguments with someone. There's no repercussions. There's no consequences. And I think reaching that level of sleep is so important, because it provides you this, and then the neurologic regeneration that happens is key. So I feel that they're all, the nutrition, the movement, and the sleep is like the most important thing in our life. And if they're all working together, then I think we get to a level of health that's wonderful, and then it can only grow from there.
Those are great pointers. Gaby, we were in a writing group together, and I had the pleasure of reading some of your writing on this subject. What sort of catharsis, clarity, or fulfillment has writing about your struggles given you?
Well, I believe that the power of the written word is enormous. When I first started writing, it was just a way to just get it all out. But then once I saw things on paper, they kind of take on a different meaning. You're committing to a certain language, to a certain word, to a certain feeling, to a certain description. And in doing that, you've now taken ownership over it. And then once we have ownership over what we are feeling, or how we are looking at our past, how we're looking at our present, then we have full control about where we want to take it. And I think that's been huge in my writing, is sort of to say, all right, I've got, I'm going to use this word to describe this. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right. So, when I talked about my brother's behavior, at first it just came as my brother was really mean to me. And then it became, he was a bully. And then the first time that I wrote down the word abuse, I was so intimidated by it. I almost felt nervous. I looked around, make sure I don't. And then I was like, yeah, because that's what it is. It's abuse. And once you can own that, then it takes on a whole new different meaning. And so the catharsis that comes with writing, I think, is magnificent. And I think it's just a wonderful tool.
Amazing. Gaby, thank you so much for joining me here today on this episode. I really admire the way in which you're taking ownership of your experience to tell your story and help others. And I'm really, really, really looking forward to reading your memoir one day.
Thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's been a pleasure, and
Same
thank you.
Here. Thanks, Gaby.
Thanks for listening to Curious Incident, a podcast for special needs families. Don't forget to subscribe for a new episode every month. For more resources and helpful information, check out our website and blog at dayanlawfirm.com. This podcast provides general information which is not intended to and does not constitute legal advice. You should not rely on this information for any purpose. For legal counsel, you should consult with an attorney to discuss your specific circumstances. Your listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC. No attorney-client relationship is established unless a retainer agreement has been executed between the client and the law offices of Adam Dayan. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any guests featured or resources mentioned on this podcast are for information purposes and are not endorsed by the law offices of Adam Dayan, PLLC.